Hello, I'm Marshall Shore, Arizona's hip historian. Today I'm joined by the Arizona State Capitol because it was recently proclaimed online to be the ugliest state capitol in America. How did that make you feel?
It makes me feel mad and upset. I'm over 115 years old, older than the state itself, and those folks at that list took a pic of my bum and called it ugly. Though I've had some work done, I don't feel that they were correct nor very polite.
You know, Capitol, you're looking quite dapper today.
Well, thank you, hip historian. I'm a humble Capitol, nothing too fancy. I'm all about local. My foundation that keeps me standing here was carved from our own nearby landmark, Camelback Mountain. My top came from Yavapai County, and the ground level is granite from South Mountain. But I have to boast about my copper top. It was old and dinged up. The wonderful youth across Arizona saved their pennies to buy me a new shiny copper dome. Thank you.
Who's with you today?
My children, the House and Senate. See, Arizona has grown a lot over the years. Instead of moving or getting rid of me and getting something new and fancy, they were added as needed. Some call them too modern, lacking class, but they are children of their era and show how we've grown since my territorial days.
Do you like it when people come to visit?
Oh, of course. I adore visitors. We're the home by and for the people. You can even get a tour of all 4 floors and hear the stories that make Arizona's history great.
When hay fever pollen invades your sinuses, brings runny nose, watery eyes, take Dristan. Dristan's like sending your sinuses to Arizona. Yes, Dristan's like sending your sinuses to Arizona. That is, Dristan helps you breathe free and easy, as if you were far away from pollen or allergy irritation. Yes, Dristan's like sending your sinuses to Arizona. Helps dry, runny nose, itchy, watery eyes. You see, Dristan tablets shrink swollen, congested nasal and sinus passages which cause runny nose and watery eyes. So you breathe free and easy fast. So when pollen invades your sinuses causing hay fever miseries, don't wish you could be in sunny, dry Arizona. Just remember, Dristan's like sending your sinuses to Arizona. Get Dristan decongestant tablets.
Hello, and welcome to today's Arizona Hip Historian Happy Hour Tour with Marshall Shore. I'm Leslie Watson, the AARP Arizona volunteer. AARP is the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering people 50 and older to choose how they live as they age. With a nationwide presence and nearly 38 million members across the nation and over 900,000 in Arizona, AARP strengthens communities and advocates for what matters most to families: health security, financial stability, and personal fulfillment. In the month of April, we will focus on fraud prevention by providing specific tools and information to help consumers with knowledge and tools to spot and avoid scams. AARP is a wise friend and fierce defender of consumers. The Fraud Watch Network is here providing free resources that will help you spot scams, get guidance from fraud specialists, and help you feel more secure knowing we advocate at the federal, state, and local levels to protect consumers and enforce the law. In April, we will launch the Gift Card Scam Initiative and focus on education and awareness against this type of scam. Visit us for resources and information at www.aarp.org/fraudwatchnetwork or at www.aarp.org/AZ. Now on to our hip historian. Take it away, Marshall.
Welcome to the show. Get ready to meet your host for the night, Arizona's very own hip historian himself, Marshall Shore.
Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all on this amazing, beautiful day of April 15th. And normally we might be a little depressed because it's tax day, but they've delayed that a little bit. So if you haven't done your taxes yet, you don't have to try and rush out midnight, which I know sometimes I have done. So I want to welcome all of you. I know some of you are out there watching we've got folks on YouTube, folks are watching on Facebook, or even Twitch. So we've been doing this for over a year now, which is pretty exciting. And today we're celebrating all kinds of things. So it is the anniversary, the 159th anniversary of the battle at Picacho, which is the most Western battle of the Civil War. It is also the anniversary of the Titanic back in 1912. So not long after Arizona became a state. It is also National ASL Day, as well as I know I've been having a lot of friends lately who have drinking a lot of kombucha. It is National Booch Day, and something I'm really bad about, National Laundry Day. So I probably should get a little bit better with my laundry, but I think I've got a couple baskets sitting in the kitchen right now, just waiting for something to happen. Not quite sure what that is. Now, I know we have some first-time people, so what can you expect? Well, we always do a little bit of trivia. We then take a break and have some Arizona music history. We'll do a little bit of show and tell, as well as Little Arizona. And because it's happy hour, there's a cocktail. And we always have an amazing guest on, and today is keeping in that vein. You're going to learn so much about the state capitol that you probably didn't know, or maybe some of you did. But that's half the fun. So some of you might be wondering, who is that man and why is he on my screen? Well, a little over 21 years ago, I was working in a library back in Brooklyn. It actually was a beautiful early 1900s Carnegie building. And I decided to trade that for a 1950s Phoenix Public Library, which it was in Central City South. It has now been replaced by an amazing building by Richard and Bauer. And so, but to do all that, we had to load everything we own into a big orange cube. And, I think it's really cool that they have been helping folks move across the country and doing it from right here because they have their International War headquarters right here in the Valley of the Sun. Now, when we moved in, we promptly moved into a 1956 ranch. Now, I'm happy to say it is pretty much a time capsule. Now, when we first bought it, it was so many tones of beige. I'm happy to say now it is a simplified two-tone of seafoam and cantaloupe instead of like 4 different beiges, which was really annoying. So there is what my kitchen looks like today. That 1956 GE electric oven that's inset in the wall matches the tile and matches that stovetop as well with the push buttons inset in the wall. So pretty much, all that original cabinetry, that's the reason why we decided this was the house for us, because it really hadn't been majorly updated. And so we tried to keep it as a time capsule, which sometimes can be a challenge. Now, when I first got here to Arizona, all I kept hearing about from people was there was no history here. But I knew that wasn't true because every time I went for an adventure, whether it was on foot, on bike, in a car, I would come face to face with so many amazing people, places, and stories. And so that really is kind of what got me doing what I'm doing now. Now, there's also that post-war boom that I think in a lot of ways made the Arizona that we all know and love today. All of those GIs that I had been stationed here, trained here, or passed on the way to somewhere else, And after the war, they were moving here in huge numbers, and in some cases looking for a house just like mine. Now, my name is Marshall Shore. I also am known as the Hip Historian. Now, you might wonder, how does one get a name like the Hip Historian? Well, back in 2012, on February 14th, which is an important day, not only because February 14th is Statehood Day, but 2012 was 100 years of statehood. And so someone gave me 15 minutes on the main stage at the Capitol, talk about anything I wanted to. And I chose to talk about one of my most favorite events that I was never able to attend. It ran from 1926 to 1955. At its height, had about 5,000 plus high school and college students involved with it to make sure that went off. It was one of those events that was touted right up there with Mardi Gras as something that everybody in the country should go and see. And a lot of folks did. And I was lucky enough to find 3 dresses pretty much in a box and was able to convince 3 beautiful friends to put those dresses on, parade around the stage as we talked about some of the history of the Mask of the Yellow Moon and what a pivoting point it was for so many of those young ladies that were dancing. Now, that explains I used to do a lot of tours, lectures kind of across the state. During this current COVID moment, those all came to a screeching halt. Now, that's one of the reasons why I did indeed start Happy Hour, because I realized I was not sharing stories with people and people weren't sharing their stories with me. And that's where the fun for me is getting to get those personal flashes from folks. Now, we have started doing a second Saturday walking tour of downtown Phoenix, where everybody is fully masked. Deb and I actually wear microphones under our masks so that everybody can hear us. And so you can find the next one coming up is going to be May 8th. And it's going to be 7 to 9. So it'll be after the sun goes down. So it'll be a little bit cooler out. Now, some of you have already discovered the chat. You can also reach out to me via Facebook, as well as email at Hello Hip Historian, or even my website. You can track me down through there. And please do. I love to hear from folks, because sometimes you get a really amazing story. All right. Now, I will ask, if you're watching on Facebook, if you can click on that share button on the bottom, just so that way all your friends will get a chance to see and know how much fun Arizona history can really be. Now, because it is a happy hour, we have to have some sort of a libation. And I'm happy to say that I've been partnering up with the Valley Ho and their bartender, PJ, who every week has been making a really unique cocktail. And so because we're talking about the state capitol and a lot of just kind of early history, this is the 5 C's, which comes out to be the Capitol Cocktail Concoction Con Cerveza. So it's got a little bit of everything in it. It's got some local gin. It's got some local beer in it. It's got a reduction. It even has a little bit of lemon pear marmalade, and he even preserved a Meyer lemon just for me that I put in it. So it kind of makes it a little salty sweet, which should be really good. And so let's see. And of course, this. Sorry about that little technical issue. All right. So let's bring on my silent bartender. We'll call him Bob. And so PJ makes it really great that he just makes these cocktails in a little glass jar that I just need to do that. He mixes all of that together. And I know some of these cocktails, they've even made their way to the bar list at the Valley Ho. And so there we go. There is our 5C cocktail capital con cerveza. All right. So cheers. Oh, and that's really nice. There's a little bit of honey in there as well. Oh, as well as some mole bitters to kind of make it, give it a little pick-me-up a little pickup in your step, which is always good. So, Little Arizona, which is a topic near and dear to my heart because I talk about how I moved here from New York, but I grew up in a small little town in the Midwest of about 25 people. And from there, moved to New York City. And so I kind of have this affinity for Little Arizona. And so I'm actually, once COVID and I were able to travel and things are open again at a larger scale, I'm working on a book called Little Arizona. And so getting a chance to explore some of those amazing little towns all over the place. And so today we are going to talk about Piñon, Arizona, which is up in Cochise County. Now, its unofficial slogan has been where the pavement ends and the Wild West begins. Now, the community that's up there doesn't really like that because of the negative connotations. But, for over a decade, they have had the highway to 191 paved. So that's no longer the issue. Now, this area was likely settled by people from Chinle who were migrating from the mountains for some sort of winter pasture so that way their animals could feed. And there you can see they even get snow there. So I would go, but definitely not at this time of year. Now it's been home to some of the best Navajo cowboys, including Willie Jody, as well as one of the Navajo code talkers, Willie Begay. So through the miracle of modern or not so modern technology, I am happy to say that we have a special guest tonight. I want to bring on Michael Cady.
Oh. Hey, Marshall.
Hey, and let's get rid of my bartender because he's not going to be any input into this conversation. So let's just get rid of him. There we go. Much better. How's your day going?
Very good.
So what did you do in this beautiful weather?
Oh, spent the day outside working in the yard. Not very exciting.
Actually, it is because, in a couple months, you don't want to be able to do that.
Yep, absolutely.
So better you get it done now than wait.
Yep.
Until it's blistering hot out. Because we all know it's a coming. So, all right. So I know you prepared a kind of a little intro to just kind of some of the Arizona history.
Okay.
So, all right.
But let me introduce myself a little bit too, maybe. I've been a history teacher here in Arizona for a long time. When I started teaching history, Richard Nixon was still president, and when I quit, Barack Obama was. So quite a few years, I guess. And I managed to graduate from ASU a couple of times before we had computers. So that's a whole nother thing for young people today. There used to be these things called 3x5 cards, and you had to take notes and all that stuff. But when I retired, I was looking for other things to do, and I have always been passionate about history. And I thought, I've taught American history, world history, things like that. Why don't I focus on where I've lived the last half century, which is Arizona, Phoenix. And I got more involved and more interested. Ended up down at the Capitol Museum as a volunteer and, greet visitors as they come into the rotunda, talk to them about Arizona. From that, with the two other fellows, developed a tour based on information that we got doing research about the amazing history and background of the Capitol building and the grounds that it's on. And we found a lot of things that we found very interesting, and that's some of what I'm going to share tonight.
All right. Very good. So then let's take a look at some of the stuff you just kind of help introduce the Capitol to folks who might not be familiar with the Capitol.
1700 West Washington, and the state capital, which of course, if you know our history a little bit, the territorial capital bounced around for a while. It was up in Fort Whipple, which is next to Prescott, went down to Tucson, back up to Prescott, and eventually to Phoenix in 1889. They used to call it the Capitol on Wheels because you think about every time the Capitol moved, you had to take all the state archives and all this stuff with you in wagons back and forth. So it was a really big deal when Phoenix was chosen to be the, at that point, territorial capital, but then hopefully state later. And, you know, we wanted to make sure we did it right. And one of the important things was building this building. That's kind of woven into it.
Indeed.
So here I'll talk a little bit about where this information comes from, and if you get interested, where you could find more. There's kind of an old saying in history is that everybody knows the story until they research it. And I think that's true. And there's some of the things that we've come up with that are pretty well documented, but sometimes people are not happy because it's not what they heard in the fourth grade, and you know, it's not what their teacher told them. That's fine. You know, we're all on a learning curve. Our information, first, there were three of us that started. Fred Anderson isn't in the photo, but that's my friend Patrick and myself, and we all three did the research. Patrick and I started doing the tours. Patrick moved back to Wisconsin, so I'm kind of doing the tours myself. A major source of our information are the papers of Gerald Doyle, which are at ASU. Our Capitol was completely renovated and almost, you know, stripped down to the walls and redone in the late 1970s. And Gerald Doyle was the restoration architect who did it. And we found out his papers were out there, and we went through boxes and boxes of stuff. And I became quite impressed with him. He was a very detailed fellow. He has little notes in there like, you know, make phone call to Los Angeles, 82 cents, you know, this kind of thing. But we found a treasure trove of things. I'll just make one comment that I just can't get out of my head, that he said, no love had been shown this building. And that's over and over again, you find that, you know, a building like this, today we see it as very important. There was a time when it was just an old building, and his job was to then kind of bring it back to life. Another source there that's on that PowerPoint, if you want to go back to the slide, the one before that one, if you can go back, there you go. Michael Carmen was the director of the Capitol Museum, and that what we think of as the Capitol has been a museum for decades. He did a book, which is the best deal in the world. If you're at all interested in this, go down to the Capitol Museum when it's open, hopefully in a few more months. I think the book is only like $2, a little pamphlet. That was the beginning for us. I mean, he used a lot of resources in the archives and all that, and very good, very thorough. Okay. Another thing we're getting our information from is a man named Randall Schmidt, professor emeritus in art from ASU. And when he was a young man, his job was reconstructing a lot of the artistic elements inside the historic Capitol. So everything, just as one example, the governor's office has the only fireplace in the whole building, and it had tile and fancy work around. A lot of it had been damaged. So his job was to actually recreate tile that would fit exactly the originals that were in there. Well, I had two opportunities to walk the building with Randall when he came over to visit, and I jumped on it immediately. And he was pointing out, yeah, when we got here, you know, we had to recreate this. This is a reproduction. This is original. You know, he'd say, you know, if you look at the grain on this wood, the tight grain is the original wood. The open grain is wood that we got later in the oak to be able to replace. So listening to him, taking notes, and that's pretty much right from the horse's mouth, I would say. And with Gerald Doyle, I also had the photo of the book there, a fellow who wrote on the architect who designed the building, and the Chris Miser book, and James Riley Gordon, who's, again, the architect who designed our territorial capital, became the state capital, was quite a guy. I mean, there's a lot to learn about him. Self-taught, started just drawing things when he's a teenager, ended up in New York City at the end of his life, the head of their architectural guild for the city. I mean, he won all kinds of awards and everything. This was an early thing for him, and there are courthouses all over Texas that he was the architect for because he was from Texas. So I'm just pointing out, there's a lot of variety of ways. Also, our own research, we've crawled in and under and on top of and measured and, everything possible we can to try to check out what we find. So that's where we got it. And, that little pamphlet at the Capitol would be very good for anybody that's interested in starting that.
Well, and then what are some of the other sources that you wind up using as well?
Well, there's this modern thing, and I don't know if everybody's aware of it, called a computer. Mine's a little smaller. The one I use is a little smaller than the one in the image there. But obviously, there's tons of online information. Library of Congress is amazing.
Right.
Arizona's own archives, the Memory Project, is amazing. We've gone over to Polly Rosenbaum and found archives and records. But, there's a lot online. But what's best is when I can combine an online, maybe a newspaper article, then find some physical thing that kind of verifies it. And it's been a lot of fun kind of collecting stories, and people come and visit on the tours all the time. And they go, well, I heard this story, and I always keep in mind, then I go research and see what I can find. And sometimes I find it's true. Sometimes it's half true. Sometimes it's just a story, but it's all fascinating to me.
Right.
So the Capitol building itself, which you can go visit, take a look at. As I mentioned, we are told you're going to become the territorial capital, so we want to build this thing. We spent 2 years constructing it. 1909, officially it was finished, but I find that actually people were still moving in by 1903 because it takes a while. The bottom photo I find quite interesting there. That's of the original construction of the granite. That's the first floor is made out of granite, and they're huge. You're like 2 to 3 feet thick granite. And I found that there were no electricity, and on site there was only one steam engine, and it was used for a saw to cut stone. And they had a lot of trouble with it, apparently. It was very difficult to get it to work right. But the moving of all these huge granite blocks kind of reminds me of the pyramids.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah. Very knowledgeable workers who knew leverage and balance and how to move things. They used like an A-frame. But I mean, today you just wheel in a big crane and just pick it up and put it where you want it. But back then it had, and I've looked at it very carefully, and it's just beautiful work. I mean, it's just as precise as can be. So I'm amazed at seeing that hand work, and they did a great job. Giving the tours down there, one of the things I often hear from tourists, especially from other places, why would anybody move here? And I think it's important to get to understanding about our capital, to understand a little bit about Arizona, and particularly Phoenix, where the capital went, late 19th century and early into the 20th century. And I think there's a lot of things involved in that. We need to, I think one important thing for us to understand is it didn't have to be this way. We're now the 5th biggest city in America. In 1950, we were barely 100th. So how did this happen? How did we go? Just there were people at the time when Arizona was a territory talking about anything west of the 100th meridian was the Great American Desert. Useless. What are you going to do with it? There were articles I read in the early days of people saying, once we've extracted all the mineral wealth out of Arizona, it'll just go back to a wasteland. Right? How do you turn that around? How do you make that into something that is vibrant? And I think a great part of the story of Phoenix is we reinvented ourselves, not only Phoenix, but Arizona, several times. Extracting mineral wealth, agriculture, citrus. Oh, people come here for tuberculosis. So send your sinuses to Arizona. I saw I remember that commercial. I was in New York also as a kid. I remember seeing that commercial. I had no idea what Arizona was when my parents told us we were moving out here, probably 1964 or so. I thought, great, I can ride a horse to school and there'll be wooden sidewalks. And I was so disappointed. It wasn't anything like that. But that's to understand. I'll give you a quote I like that I think demonstrates it. William Tecumseh Sherman, the Sherman of the Civil War, said, we fought a war to get that Southwest territory. We should fight another to make them take it back. Sherman came through in the 1870s. Imagine, no air conditioning. He thought it was worthless. Generation before Kit Carson came through, he said it was so bad a wolf would starve to death. So how do you turn this around? That's kind of the story. So give the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about early Phoenix. One of the things to understand, the boosters, the early movers and shakers of Phoenix, wanted to not create that Western, kind of culture. The whole idea of cowboys and cactus and all that stuff. They did not want that. They purposely tried to show that we're modern. We want capital investment. We want bankers in Chicago and San Francisco to say that's a safe place to put our money. And that means if you look at a lot of these early photos, as I and many of my friends do, you'll notice people wearing like bowler caps and, a vest and a suit and tie. It's not, cowboys, lariats, and that kind of thing. They were trying to get away from that, basically to bring in investment. Now that slide shows that we were also viewing ourselves very modern. We had an opera house and eventually more than one. We had a natatorium, which was pretty exciting, which I had to look up the first time I ran across that. It means an indoor swimming pool, which is still there. East Lake Park.
Oh, yeah.
Which many times is said to be the first public park in Phoenix. Some friends of mine looked into it and they said there was actually one before that was on the grounds of now is the Carnegie Museum, the library that's there. And that's a beautiful building and wonderful that it was preserved. But we had a trolley system. And that ties a little bit into the story of the Capitol, because the guy that ran the trolley system also gave the land that became where the Phoenix, where the territorial capital is right now. But we had a trolley system. Now, he was a real booster. His name was Moses Hazelton Sherman. It was commented, they said, yeah, the trolley, but it's not real long. And he said, yeah, but it is just as wide. So he was a promoter of Phoenix. And I think we had a lot of guys like that, but we had, a music school and a skating rink. And we were promoting Phoenix as a modern, up-to-date place where you can come, settle, and bring your capital and invest. Let's go to the next one. Now, here's a famous Dyer bird's eye view, which I notice you have behind you as well.
Indeed, because it's not famous.
1885. I put, just for an example, that red arrow points to off the map is where the capital would be. So this shows you how small Phoenix was in 1885. Now it says the population was 3,000. I found you have to be a little cautious because populations are often going by census records and voting records. And of course, not everybody's counted. Women couldn't vote. Lots of other people were not included. But, 3,000 maybe, maybe by 1900, maybe 5,000, but we're pretty small. One of the changes we made at first in the early maps of Phoenix, the north-south streets were named of Native American tribes. And they were Apache and, so forth. And they decided to get away from that. One reason was, again, that's not modern. That's like that West. So numbers are better. And then also numbers go on indefinitely. I don't know what would they have done, 300th Avenue if they had to still be finding Native American names. But that map is wonderful. The man who created that also did one of Tempe and one of Prescott.
And I think he's actually buried at the Pioneer Cemetery.
He sure is. Yeah, his first name is Czar. C-Z-A-R.
Oh, wow.
Thing, yeah. So let's go on to the next one. And another thing that surprises people is Phoenix had ice, and you don't necessarily need electricity to make ice. We were making ice with a steam engine to compress gas, basically the same principle of our air conditioning units today. You compress it and release it, either pulls in or releases heat, depending on what you're doing. Without the ice, we would have had a lot of problems because we're in an alluvial plain. A lot of the Salt River Valley is similar to Egypt and the Nile. We have this wide alluvial plain of eons of dropping nutrients along it as it floods. All you have to do is to get water to it and you can grow. So we start growing things, but then how do you get them to market? Well, in our heat, if you filled up a train full of lettuce and sent it on to California, by the time it gets there, you got a problem. So we filled the railroad cars with ice, and people could get ice at home. Mom would put a little sign outside that had numbers on it, 10, 20, and it was telling the ice man how many pounds of ice you wanted. And downtown hotels would have a big chunk of ice in the lobby with a fan on it to try to cool you off. So people tried to do things to make it cooler, but that heat's always going to be a problem before air conditioning. Our capital, by the way, didn't ever have central air until it was redone by Gerald Doyle by the early 80s. So.
And I think, yeah. And so, I mean, like when you talk about the ice house, I mean, it is one of what would have been like a dozen different ice houses. It's the only one still standing. The rest have all been torn down.
That would have been a major enterprise, and we needed it. It wasn't just for comfort. It was for getting our agriculture out and to sell it to around the country.
Right.
And the big thing, of course, for the Salt River Valley is the Salt River flooded miles wide. I mean, huge floods before the Roosevelt Dam and all the other dams on the Salt. And that was a big thing, too, is we needed capital investment, eventually federal money, in order to do the things that were going to make us successful. I can't imagine what Central Arizona would have been without the Roosevelt Dam. I mean, it's hard to even imagine. And it was the first major reclamation project the federal government did. And the last big one was the Central Arizona Project, which is also Arizona. So both of those took huge investment, which individual entrepreneurs tried at one point, but just couldn't do it. It just took too much money to really control that water. And a lot of historians would say the history of civilization is really the story of controlling water. Fundamentally, that's what it gets down to. And in the valley, that's everything.
Right. Especially in the desert where things don't grow without water.
Yep.
All right. All right, so we're getting ready for some trivia. Now, we do our trivia a little different. So we'll actually go through the questions, which are all multiple choice. so that even if you don't know the answer, you still have a chance of getting it right just by guessing. And after that, we'll take a little bit of a break. And then it's so exciting because we actually go through and Michael will tell us the story about some of those answers. So that way you'll know more about Arizona history than when you walked in this evening. When you sat down in front of your computer or your phone, you'll have a lot more. So once we can get to a cocktail party, you will have great stuff to talk about. All right. So now you can keep track of, some folks keep track of trivia in the chat session. Some folks do it on a pad and paper. Whatever you feel comfortable with, you go right ahead and do that. All right. So question 1. The dome on top of the Arizona Capitol was originally made of A, copper, B, Tournay metal, C, petrified wood, or D, fiberglass. Which one of those things was the original dome on the Arizona Capitol first made of? Not what it's made of now, what it was originally made of. All right. What is the name of the Texas architect who designed the Arizona Territorial Capitol? A, James Riley Gordon, B, Frank Lloyd Wright, C, Lesher Mahoney, or D, J. Riley Gordon? All right, so one of those folks is a Texas architect that we mentioned. All right, so going on to question 3. If you visit the Capitol today, you may notice a particular unusual feature. What are they? A, windows to bring light in from outside. B, openings for workers to pass messages between offices. C, dumbwaiters used to bring books and materials up and down the 4 floors. Or D, courts or air ducts for passive cooling of the building. So what do you think those nicely framed holes in the wall are for? All right. Which one of the following would you have not found on the grounds before the Capitol was constructed? An alfalfa farm. B, remnants of an ancient Hohokam village. C, a beautiful city park with banana plants and a Chinese bamboo forest. Or D, a trolley line. Which one would you not have found on the grounds before the Capitol was constructed? Which statement is not true regarding our historic Capitol? A, in its design, the entrance was to be on the 2nd floor. B, it was very expensive compared to most state capitals of the era. C, the lighting fixtures had both gas and electricity in the same fixture. Or D, the power for the elevator came from the trolley line on Adams. Which statement is not true about the Capitol? All right. Question 6. Which of the following statements is not true regarding the statue on top of the Capitol? A, it originally cost $160. B, it is a unique piece of art created just for our Capitol. D or C, the lady has gained 200 pounds since 1900, possibly even more during COVID. Or D, in the restoration during the late 1970s and early 80s, bullet holes were found and repaired. Which of those statements is not true about the statue on the Capitol? Question 7. Which artist's work is depicted here and is on display in the Capitol Museum? Lon McGargy, Jay Datis, the father of Arizona, Charles D. Poston, or D, cowboy artist Hattie Mosier? Which artist can you go see work by at the Capitol? All right. Which architect offered this design called the Oasis to be the state of Arizona to replace the current Capitol building back in 1957? A, I.M. Pei. B, Jay Datis. C, Murano Yamasaki. Or D, Frank Lloyd Wright. So which one of those architects designed something called the Oasis? All right, coming into the home stretch. Are there ghosts in the historic Capitol? Which of the following is not true? A worker named Roy Murdoch was severely injured in the boiler room in 1957 and died in the hospital. B, there was a murder-suicide in the rotunda of the Capitol back in 1912. A visitor fell from the 4th floor, and some people claim to see their ghost from time to time. Or D, I have never seen one. All right, so which one of those is not true about the state capitol? Which of the following is not true of the historic Capitol? It is today a beautiful and important part of our Arizona history that is open to the public and worthy of a visit and our attention. B, it has always been considered to be a valuable historic treasure by the state of Arizona. C, it was almost torn down or gutted several times in our history. Or D, it had a major revitalization and reformation in the late 70s and early 80s. All right, so while you are sitting down trying to go through some of those answers, we're going to take a little bit of an Arizona music break as we get a chance to talk about some Arizona music. And a lot of times we aren't able to play because of copyright music, but this because I think we'll actually be able to play because it was written so long ago, it's out of copyright. So we are going to talk about one of 3 Arizona songs, whether you're talking about the state or the territory. So we're not talking about Arizona's The Sun-Kissed Land, which was the 1901 territorial song. We're going to talk about the Arizona March song that was written by Margaret Rowe Clifford back in 1950. The music was composed by Morris Blumenthal. Now, initially, the second governor of Arizona actually didn't sign this. It was a delegation from Cochise County because the 2 involved with the creation of the piece were both from Douglas. And some of the folks were actually not happy about this song because there was that earlier territorial song. And then, of course, there's always the famous one done by Rex Allen called Arizona. Now, if you listen to the lyrics, at one point they talk about dos cabezas, or 2 heads in Spanish, which refer to a pair of twin peaks in Cochise County. So they're able to work in a little plug for their own home.
Come to this land of sunshine, to this land where life is young, where the wide, wide world is waiting, the songs that will now be sung, where the golden sun is flaming into warm, white, shining day, and the sons of men are blazing their priceless right of way. Sing the song that's in your hearts. Sing of the great Southwest. Thank God for Arizona, in splendid sunshine dressed, for thy beauty and thy grandeur, for thy regal robes so sheen. We hail thee, Arizona, our goddess and our queen. Stand beside the rivers within our valley broad. Stand here with heads uncovered in the presence of our God, while all around about us the brave unconquered band, as guardians and landmarks, the giant mountains stand. Sing the song that's in your hearts. Sing of the great Southwest. Thank God for Arizona, in splendid sunshine dressed, for thy beauty and thy grandeur, for thy regal robes so sheen. We hail thee, Arizona, our goddess and our queen. We hail thee, Arizona, our goddess and our queen. We hail thee, Arizona, our goddess and our queen.
All right. So, a lot of folks talk about how bad that song is. I don't think it's quite as bad as it's made out to be. Rex Allen's song, I know, is probably a lot more popular because it's a little more modern. I've not been able to find a copy of that Arizona Sun-Kissed Land. So I always like to throw it out there. If anybody out there has a copy of it, would love to hear what it sounds like and why were people saying that song was better than the song we just heard. So
Marshall, can I just add, you mentioned Tom Campbell there as a Republican governor. If anybody wants some really bizarre things in Arizona's history, look at the election. I think it was 1916. George Wiley Paul Hunt, who was our first governor, against Campbell. And it ended up kind of similar as the 2000 election, if you remember dimpled Chads and all that, where they said Campbell won and Hunt refused to leave office because he said no, he didn't. And it had to do with ballots where you could check at the top all Democrat or all Republican. And what had happened, people had put down all Democrat, but then over here voted for Campbell as Republican governor. Hunt said, all those ballots are mine. As soon as you put all Democrats, it's my ballot, and you can't vote again. So that second vote for Campbell didn't work. And for almost a year, we had two people claiming to be governor, and eventually Hunt won. He spent some of his own money, from what I've read, fighting it out in court, but eventually won. And then Campbell came back and won the next election, as I remember. But it was kind of an interesting example if you look at, some of the politics we've seen today.
And although I do like people making comments about how, they're not a fan of the song and that I might be wrong and that it's not that bad. I mean, it could be worse. I mean, that's why I really want to find this 1901 territorial song to see how bad that is. Because this could be an improvement. Who knows? So, all right. So we're getting ready for some answers to the trivia questions. And so the dome on top of the Arizona Capitol was originally made of B.
Turn metal. And I know that's a surprise, and many books will say it was originally copper. It really isn't. In Doyle's notes, for example, he commented that the original dome up there had been leaking for at least 50 years, and the only thing holding it together was all the tar and patch people had put. But it was the turn metal, which is basically steel coated in zinc. And the reason it was not originally copper was when they were building it, they went to the copper industry in Arizona and said, hey, it's the copper state. We're building the Capitol. You should donate the copper. And they said, no. Well, I don't see why we should. And it was less expensive to use this turn metal and then paint it to look like copper. And apparently it took 200 gallons of paint. Although originally it looks like it was white and has been different colors, but eventually they got into the routine of painting it to look like copper. It is copper today, because when Gerald Doyle was in charge of refurbishing the Capitol, he went back to the copper industry and said, you guys kind of made a mistake once. Why don't you help out this time? And they did. And there was a campaign of children giving pennies and all kinds of stuff. But it is copper today, but originally it wasn't.
Indeed. All right. What is the name of the Texas architect who designed the Capitol?
This is an interesting story, and I think says a lesson about history. It's actually and it's spelled Riley as Riely. Although the hint that I gave you is on the second floor, carved in marble, showing his name misspelled. So why? And I've heard people say, well, somebody was angry at him or whatever. And it's actually a more simple explanation. James Riley Gordon generally went by the name Riley, and that was his mother's maiden name. And she spelled it Riely. Now, most people might have spelled Riley like a name, Riley, or different variations. So people, I think, just didn't realize that he had this unusual spelling for it. And if you show the next slide, you show you another place on the Capitol. Now, this is a bronze plaque that's out front. It was done by Woodsmen of America, or Woodsmen of the World.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to be fair, I looked into this, like, how did this mistake keep happening? There was a newspaper article in the early days that described that, for one thing, said that the foundation stone came from Camelback, which we don't think it did. And it also misspelled his name, but in a different way. So there's actually two misspellings, and both are unique. But they were going by, in the 60s, when they were coming up with this, what people thought was true at the time. And show the next slide, and I'll show you why I don't think the Camelback is correct either. A friend of mine, Ed Dobbins, and I started looking into this, and I found 1899 March. Now, this is just as they started digging the foundation, and the company, Ryerson and Barnes, who was in charge of the stone, showed the contractor, whose name was Tom Lovell. He was also from Texas. And they were looking, the foundation, that building, by the way, that's never going anywhere. It's 8 foot down. They filled it with concrete blocks and cement. And then this Malpai, and that's not a misspelling, but I see it spelled both ways, so I'm not sure which. And then they filled the Malpai, and then red brick. So it's like super heavy, solid foundation. There's no basement under it. which sometimes is misunderstood. There are basements under the 2 additions, but not under the original. So Ed and I were looking into, well, where would they get malapite? And I'm not a geologist, but I've had them tell me you're not going to find it around Camelback, but it's up north, basically around where Thunderbird High School is. So I found that old article that describes 13 miles north on Black Canyon Road, which today we would call 19th Avenue. So I think it's pretty clear what happened was a newspaper reporter at some point flipped it around and made the mistake, called it Camelback. And from that point on, that ended up on bronze plaques and whatnot. And if you show the next one, next slide, I've been trying to research down where all the stone came from in the Capitol. This is granite, which they said came from South Mountain, and I'm pretty sure it did. Got to go tramping around down in South Mountain Park with park rangers, Stephanie Mahan, who's the director of the museum, director from the Mineral Museum, a bunch of people, archaeologists, and we were poking around. We didn't dig. And here's what we found. Now, that's cut stone. That looks to me like stone that's been man cut to chop up into pieces, hauled with wagons 10 miles from the mountains, South Mountain. And the one on the right, it looks like a really old anchor point, because the way they move these heavy blocks, again, was leverage and balance. So to move them around, you had these anchor points and cables, and some of those were still in the stone. And if you look at the stone, it's identical. And I've had geologists tell me that you can tell if the granite comes from there because of the specific way the pattern is, and it matches. So we're, definitely the granite came from there. We think the malapite probably didn't come from Camelback Mountain. The upper levels are something I call tufa, and that's from Skull Valley around in Arizona. And I haven't been up there yet. I was like to find out exactly where that came from, but it's a softer stone, a little less expensive. And that was a major point building this Capitol, as we wanted it as inexpensive as possible. So they're always looking for ways to do it cheaper. So the architect, James Riley Gordon, knew that Arizona is hot. And we did things in the early days before air conditioning to try to cool it off. And what you see today, when I first came in the Capitol, I looked at that, I couldn't figure out what it is because it's not an external window. And obviously it's closed. Well, when you add central air conditioning, you have to close off all the gaps. So all these courts were closed off with the glass you see. But when it was open, these would have been around the rotunda on each of the 4 floors. The architect's idea is you open the windows on the ground floor. That cool air comes in, hot air goes up, and it goes out the top of the building. So you have kind of a passive cooling system that goes around, to make it a little cooler. Now, again, I still would like air conditioning, but it made it cooler. He also originally had awnings out front. And some of the early photos of the Capitol show awnings. And Gerald Doyle wanted to put awnings on it when they rebuilt it. But they wanted to do aluminum. And he said aluminum awnings would look terrible on it and refused. And so there's no awnings on it today. But they did do things to try to make it cooler. And the environment was a little cooler, as we know, more agricultural, right. Less of the heat sink with the concrete. Right. It's still, though, realize, our legislature wants to get out of town before the summer hits. So we have a legislature, from January to maybe April, something like that, and then get out. But there were people that worked there during the summer, and I'm not sure how they did in the early days.
All right. So which one of these would you not have found on the grounds of the Capitol?
One of the reasons this site was selected, and they looked at 5 possible sites. There was a capital commission whose job it was to find where in Phoenix this is going to be. And they looked at several places, but one reason this was chosen was there were no Indian ruins. And you're familiar, of course, all over Phoenix were various settlements. Where the Pioneer Cemetery was actually a village, Hohokam Village at one point. The history of the grounds the Capitol's on, it was first purchased as a section of land. It's, I think, about 640 acres. And a guy sold part of that to this Moses Sherman. And the guy that had the trolley car, Moses Sherman did a lot of things. He was a school teacher, he real entrepreneur. He took 10 acres and donated it to the territory for this building. And his idea was then to build up the community around it and sell lots for houses. And in those days, you didn't have a car. Trolleys were how people got around. Trolleys were there before automobiles. So he had a trolley line that would have run right through the front door of the Capitol and out, and then sold the houses on the side so you could, get on the trolley and go to downtown Phoenix if you had to work, come back out. The trolley line was made pretty cheaply. It wasn't made to last. It was made to basically sell those houses along it. And there's some photos showing the Capitol in construction and the trolley line still kind of going up to it. And then they had to get after him to move it. And he moved it over to Adams, and it went out to about 27th Avenue. And that was the furthest it went to the west. Moses Hazelton Sherman left Arizona, went to California, and became really wealthy. There's a foundation over there still in his name. Sherman Oaks, California is named after him. He was a developer in a place called Hollywood Land. If you ever watched the movie Chinatown about the water in the Owens Valley, it was a long, interesting story. He was one of the guys involved in that. So he made lots of money when he left. He had a partner, his name was Marcus Collins, who stayed in Phoenix, but they donated the land so that they could develop the area around it, which is not unusual. I mean, that's the way people made money then and today. Buy a large chunk of land and divide it up and sell it in small pieces. But before it was the Capitol, it was actually a park that did have banana plants, citrus, dozens of different kinds of palms, every kind of tree imaginable. They'd hired a horticulturist and gave it its own water supply. It had a little canal bringing water out to that park. And the whole idea was to find out what grew in Arizona. And it was really kind of a fascinating thing. The guy's name was George Hugh Smith. And he, I think, did a lot. That was a beautiful park. People liked to go out. They could get on the trolley and go out on a Sunday afternoon and walk around the shaded park. And that was before the Capitol was there.
All right. So which was not true about our Capitol?
Yeah, very inexpensive, our Capitol. They tried to make it started at $100,000. That go to the next slide and it gets into that. Just to compare some of the other states that were coming in roughly about our time, millions of dollars. Obviously, states like New York, 25 million. We're going to try to do it for 100,000. So part of the story is, how do we make this Capitol as inexpensive as possible? James Riley Gordon had bigger plans that had to be cut back and cut back and cut back. He said he could make a Capitol that would be nice for about 20 years, and then we would have to, expand because it wouldn't be big enough. There's all kinds of stories about ways they found to cut costs. Originally, the columns that are out front, were supposed to be Corinthian, which were fancier, and they decided to go to the Doric columns that were simpler. All the tufa stone was originally going to be smooth, and they decided they didn't really need to do that. So if you look at it today, it's a rough surface, which I like anyway. But lots of things happened. There was that original plan to enter the Capitol on the second floor, and there would be a grand staircase leading up to it. And he took that out before, they even started building, as a way to save money. So what we enter the Capitol is actually, that was for deliveries and things like that. That wasn't the grand entrance. The grand entrance was the second floor. But again, we had to find ways to save money, which they did.
Indeed, they did.
Yeah, Tom Lovell was the guy who actually went through all the effort. And boy, he didn't get paid a penny till it was all done. He had to put up a bond. I mean, that must have been a pretty tough deal for him. And I think a lot of architects would kind of commensurate with this. We said, yeah, 100,000, that's it. That's all we want. And then they go, well, how about light fixtures? Oh yeah, well, we need that. Drinking fountains. Oh yeah, we hadn't thought of that yet. And then you start adding carpeting, and there's an awful lot of stuff you're not thinking of that is more than just the building itself. So it came in at about $136,000 total. But the territory was going to save money because the federal government had to permit us to do this. Congress, as a territory, we don't get to vote for our own governor. We don't get to make our own decisions. When I give tours with fourth graders, I would tell them being a territory is kind of like being in the fourth grade. You don't get to decide how late you stay up or night or things like that. Somebody else is going to do that for you. But we had to rent rooms in the city hall downtown. It was $475 a year. And they decided that building this and paying the interest on the bonds to cover it would actually be cheaper than renting the rooms that they had. So it looked like a win-win all around. And I would say, if the taxpayers of Arizona, if there's one building we have gotten our money's worth out of 100 times over, it's that building. 120 years,
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't a unique piece of art at all. It was out of an architectural catalog. And I've looked through some of these from the time period, and they're just endless examples of statues and, all kinds of fancy grill work and whatever you want. And this is just one of many. And it was $160 and $15 to have it shipped from Ohio. And it went up on top. And at first they weren't sure even what to call it. Winged Victory and, different things. It originally would rotate with the wind, whereas the wind would catch it. She would point the laurel wreath the direction the wind is coming from. In the 1950s, legislature didn't like that. Some people say it was because the winds kept turning it to where the backside of the statue was pointing at them. I don't know if that's true. But they locked it in place, which, looking at Gerald Doyle's notes, ruined it. It destroyed the mechanism. It was built to move freely, and they had to reconstruct it to make it work. And now it does. Now it works the way it should.
Does.
And
you can sit there and watch it move in the breeze.
It's beautiful. I love it. And that story of bullet holes, that's an interesting one where, many people, it's bullet holes. And I read it in books. Some of the books have stories of, cowboys coming out and celebrating and whatever. So I looked into it and I talked with Randall Schmidt, and he said, yeah. And I saw in his papers, there was photos of a big crane pulling the thing down, 16-foot, statue, and they found bullet holes. At least they found holes that looked like bullet holes, and they had to be fixed. So those are repaired. So somebody somewhere along the line, were they celebrating statehood? Who knows? But it appears to be the case. She did gain 200 pounds, which, because she started off at 400 pounds and ended up at 600, because they filled it with foam to give it more structure so that it would last longer today. And then they put a coating on the outside of it. So they had to do a lot to preserve it. But it's based on a Greek statue. I saw photos of Alexander the Great holding it up, and it looks just like it in Egypt. So it wasn't original to the building. It's a standard issue that you could have gotten at the time. Lon McGargy.
Right. Yeah, tell us about Lon McGargy.
Well, cowboy artist. I really like his stuff. He was very well trained. He came out here as a young man. He sold a set of paintings when George Wiley Paul Hunt met with him, and they're all over the Capitol. I'm trying to remember now, maybe 15 of them. Maybe that's too many. The one irrigation, my favorite, many people's favorites. Sometimes people have thought it was a little racy.
I know, it's so scandalous. Oh my gosh. I think I can see an ankle.
I don't get it, but it's the essence of the Salt River Valley is, of course, the water going on, and then you see the things growing nice and green. Lon McGargy didn't like bananas when I was reading up about him, because as a young man, when he came out here, he wanted to be a cowboy, and he did. He was a real cowboy, actually had a ranch and everything too while he was doing his sketches. But all he had to eat all the way out here was bananas. And he said never wanted to eat another one in his life. So he didn't like bananas.
Understandable.
And of course, the Hermosa Inn was his house at one point.
Right.
And he was married something like 5 times at least, and had friends over, and eventually it turned into a hotel. And now, of course, it's a very fancy, nice hotel with a beautiful restaurant and
a great bar, The Last Drop.
Yep. And part of the wall, if you go inside that restaurant, part of the original wall that he built, made out of adobe, is kind of inset. That's the photo I took there.
Okay.
And what they call lawns.
All right. And then we have another artist.
And Jay Davis, again, another famous artist, beautiful work. Unfortunately, you can't see it because it's in what was the law library in the 1919 edition. And they pulled all that out a couple of years ago, all the law library and everything. I don't know what's going to happen, but the building that it was in is closed. But he's another famous artist. Some people come just to see his stuff too.
All right. So tell us about the Oasis.
So the Frank Lloyd Wright story has many different versions and different ways to look at it. He did have this drawing, which originally, from my understanding, was going to be in Baghdad, in Iraq, and ended up offering it to the state of Arizona. It's amazing. I mean, like all Frank Lloyd Wright things, it's really astounding to look at. I'm not sure how it was going to work. I mean, it would have fountains coming out of the middle of it from what I've seen. You can see that spire in the middle if you go out to Scottsdale Road and Frank Lloyd Wright Boulevard.
Yeah.
They have a miniature kind of version of that and a very beautiful little kind of park memorial to it. But when I looked further into it, I found he intended that to be in Papago Park and only for the very top level of Arizona government. So most of the government would still be back at the location where we are today it would only be a handful of people working in this, beautiful facility, which was going to be expensive. And there's a lot of version. If you go out to Taliesin West, which is well worth it, go, anybody that hasn't. They have the original drawings and things that you can see there. I'm not sure it fit Arizona in 1957. I don't know, to me. And I also noticed in some newspaper articles, he rubbed people the wrong way sometimes.
No, not Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, he was never accused of lacking, his own opinions, let's say. And I just noticed in some of the articles that talked about he came to the legislature and basically said, hey, you should be grateful. Here's my drawing. You should do it. And then referred to like senators as Sonny Boy. And my guess is that didn't go over well. But for whatever reason, this was one of many ideas that didn't happen.
Right. Although they did, it's like you can see, it was a beautiful structure.
Architecturally, and again, there's a lot of opinion. I think it's amazing. I've looked at a lot of his buildings and things. I'm not sure I'd want to live in one, frankly, because it's more, to me, is more like what an architect would see as something, their piece. But trying to live in the house maybe would be a problem.
Right.
But it's amazing to look at, yeah. So are there ghosts? And that always seems to be something people are curious about. I've never seen one. If there's a ghost, there's only the closest reason would be 1912. There was a murder-suicide right in the rotunda. As you walk in and you turn to the right, what used to be our gift shop was once the land office. And a guy named Frank Kaufman bought a piece of land that apparently already had some taxes due on it. It gets complicated trying to figure out what he was upset about. And he blamed Granville Malcolm Gillette and came in and shot him and then walked out in the rotunda and killed himself. And I've had many people suggest, didn't somebody fall from the 4th floor and die? No, not that anybody's ever heard, seen, nothing in the news. I don't believe it. The other thing is Roy Murdoch did die of wounds in the boiler room. Now, the original boiler room is what today is the Starbucks. If you go into the Capitol Rotunda and turn to the right, there's a Starbucks. Well, that originally was the boiler room to create heat. And my understanding, and it's filled in now, my understanding is there was a tunnel from that went over to the agriculture building on Adams, which is a gorgeous building. If anybody hasn't seen that, 1930s, the motif I would say is like desert art deco. It's very unique and beautiful. But apparently that ran steam lines all the way out to the agriculture building for it. And he apparently, was injured at some point, but he died in the hospital. Some of us there thought when they were talking about putting in the Starbucks, which is relatively new, it wasn't there when I first started there. We thought they should call it the boiler room because that's what it was. It was originally the boiler room. But a lot of the things have changed around there. What, used to be this, now it's something else. The rooms have changed. So no ghosts that I know of.
All right. So which of the following is not true?
So it's not true that it was always considered a valuable historic treasure. And I think there's a lesson here about old buildings. And, my opinion would be we need to preserve more of them. But I think what happens is it starts off and people are very proud. 1901, 1905, 1912, people would, our building, look how beautiful it is. Now think about, though, by 1950, old plumbing that doesn't work, old electricity, nothing, Things are broken. They haven't been kept up. And they say, well, we need to do something. Well, this plan, the one on the slide, showed a 1940 idea, which you can barely see the original Capitol kind of in the middle. They were going to add a more modern, like 1950s view on the ends, and then literally take that whole dome and down and carve that whole thing out and build a high rise kind of right in the middle of the building. So the territorial capitol we see today would have just been gone. This was another idea. That whole complex was going to be redone with I think it was 20 stories, as I remember, building 16 feet in front of the current Capitol. And you could find it. I've blown that image up, and you can find the old Capitol, but it just completely dwarfed. I mean, just imagine this huge modern skyscraper 16 feet in front of the front door. You might as well level it then if you're going to do that. But at the time, people wanted to be modern, right? That Capitol, that's old. We want something new and, something that looks modern. And I'm sure it was frustrating when the electricity didn't work and the plumbing didn't work. And so these old buildings, I think, go through, that's the critical moment when they no longer have that allure of being new, and they're starting to be a hassle to actually live in and work in. And people are going, it might be easier to just tear the whole thing down. And then at some point they go, well, maybe it's worth saving. And then from the 1970s, what really saves it is the American Bicentennial. There was federal money available. They put it on the list of historic buildings, and we could get help. There was state money and federal money, and it could be brought back to life. And that's really what saved it. And now I think people appreciate it. I know you alluded earlier to the most ugly Capitol of all the 50. And what I found looking into that, they were looking at the executive tower.
Right.
On the west side, looking at and I don't blame them that. I don't think there's anything beautiful about that building at all.
Right. But it's the back. It's really the back of the building. It's not the front of the building.
The back. Yeah.
So that's why in the video, that's why with the puppet talks about, or the Capitol says, they took a pic of my bum, which they did. They took a picture of backside.
I agree. Yeah. And I think that's funny.
Well,
But we're lucky that building is there, because there were many times there were plans ready to level it or gut it or do all kinds of things to it that it would basically have disappeared.
All right. Now, I guess we have some extra credit coming up.
Well, as a teacher, I always felt like I always have to give some extra credit. This is the room, you could say, where Arizona was born, of course. This is the House chamber, historic House chamber on the 3rd floor. Just opposite of it is the Senate. But this is where the Constitutional Convention met, 1910, to draw up the Constitution, hoping that the U.S. Congress would accept it. And we had tried it once before and they didn't. And there was a whole issue, if we could be separate from New Mexico, and that was an issue. And we finally were ready to write our Constitution. But in those days, we were very progressive. And we had things like people initiating their own laws, which some states do and some don't. But Arizona that's an enormous power of the people. And we've done it. We've had initiatives pass where the legislature has nothing to do with it. The people voted, they made it law. And that we could recall elected officials. This became a big problem. The president at the time was William Howard Taft. Taft is the only person that, after being president, went to serve in the Supreme Court of the United States. And Taft had always been a judge. And he said, I will not sign the Constitution if you can recall judges. He had a good argument. He said, if you can recall judges, that means judges have to make decisions based on popularity, not based in law. That was his argument. The other issue at the time was even more controversial, women's vote. And Congress had pretty much let us know that there was no way we could get our Constitution accepted with women's vote. So we didn't include it, and we took out recall. And then Taft signed it. And then within that next year, since a state can amend its own Constitution without the federal Congress, we added women's vote and recall. Now, an interesting part of the story, I think, is Taft knew we would do that. It's politics. He was a very smart fellow. He knew that, he wanted to make his statement that he didn't like it, but he knew once we're a state, we can do what we want. So we added women's vote, and we could recall elected officials. And so that's the place where the people met. It's interesting giving tours there for students, because I have them look at the nameplates. Each desk has a name on it, and almost very few, I think maybe 4, are people from Arizona. The people in there who made the Constitution were from Ireland and Mexico and Canada, Czechoslovakia, one of them. They're all over. People were coming to Arizona for the opportunity because this was a happening place. One of the big things, you could come here as a farmer. I've read that over in places like Peoria, you could get 5 or 6 crops of alfalfa in a year because we don't have winter. So you're buying land cheaply. If you can get water to it and you're turning it over several times a year, that's a lot more profitable than probably back in Peoria, Illinois, which is what Peoria was named after. But it's the opportunity. On those nameplates are also, everybody seems to either be a miner or mining engineer of some kind, only a handful of lawyers, cattlemen. That was another one, of course, as well. But there were people coming here that created that Constitution. And, 1910, 1912, it would be hard for you to be old enough to have actually been born in Arizona, right? And to be in that group at the time. And of course, again, no women in those days. It was all a men's club, and minorities, of course, that's a whole nother thing to get into, another story. But that's where the Constitution was born, and we finally became a state. That connected, it was a big deal because then it was sea to sea, right? We connected from the oceans, and Arizona was the last of the linchpin there to hold it together. Another extra credit. All those are true. One of the things he ran across, as for people working in the Capitol, how do you survive the heat? You're in an office, and some of the offices are small. They started adding their own room air conditioners, and they were sticking out of the windows. And you can find articles in the newspaper, people complaining, it looks terrible, and they're all different. It's just a mess. Well, what happened was they were all different sizes, and people were destroying the windowsills, the wooden frame around the window. And Gerald Doyle commented he had to replace them all. They all had to be replaced because when you took all those old units out, they had done a bad job. Again, as he said, that no love had been shown the building. A lot of repairs had been done kind of hastily. Again, it wasn't this revered building. It was a workplace, and it wasn't a place where tourists came. It was a place where you went to get a job done, and had a completely different kind of view on it. And the other one there was, they painted the dome, and there's a lot of red bricks on that. The entrance into that Capitol, as I said, there is no basement, but there are a couple of little crawl spaces. One is the elevator, all mechanicals for the elevator. A lot of them are under the ground level. So there's a little room and you can kind of poke around. I've been down in that and one on the other side to see as far as I can. And what you find is a lot of red brick, lots and lots of red brick. It's not going anywhere, that Capitol. And when they talk about getting rid of it, I wonder how in the world they would have.
Dynamite.
Yeah, I mean, wow. It's solid.
Indeed it is. All right, Michael. Well, thank you so much for coming on and letting us talk about the Capitol for a little bit. Hopefully soon the Capitol, as well as other museums, will be open. And I know some museums are, but some aren't. So hopefully the Capitol Museum will be opening its doors soon.
I hope so. Ready to get back.
Indeed. I think we all are. All right, Michael. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. All right. Well, in case you were wondering how much fun we were going to have with Arizona history, well, now you know you need to click on that share button so all your friends can enjoy the little lessons of the state capitol, which I bet not many of you knew. I mean, there's always fun little factoids. So that's always the fun of this. So how did everyone do? You know, we range on this show from people getting like 3 out of 10 to, I know we've had some lately where people got almost every single one right. So I think it's always kind of funny just to kind of see how people did on their trivia. Well, you're telling me about that. We're going to go on to another segment, show and tell. So, okay. So I have a house full of stuff. And so this is a milk jug that you would have had delivered right to your door, but it's actually from a very unique place. And that is CAD, Central Avenue Dairy, which was right along Central. It is no longer there. There's what originally it was a house around the turn of the century. The Greer family basically moved in when they came to Arizona. It's like in the late 1800s, they brought with them 7 kids, 2 horses, 2 cows, and they started selling their extra product to the neighborhood. And so one thing led to another. They then wound up building the Central Avenue Dairy. It was the first place to actually be using mechanics to milk cows with in the entire state. Now, it sold back in the 1950s to Carnation just up the street. And there was a big remodel back in the late 20s. Now, when it sold, they actually sold 17 of the horses and wagons. And I've often heard people talk about where did those wind up? So if anyone knows where any of these Central Avenue Dairy carts have gone, please let me know, because I know there are people actually looking for them. I mean, I think it would help make a wonderful display. And we're talking, this is one of the things where it was like up until when it sold, they were still in the 50s, in the late 40s, early 50s, they were still delivering that milk with those horse and carts. So if you can imagine that, the streets full of cars, but here is your milkman. If you walk through some of the sort of neighborhoods, you'll see they have a little door on the side of the house. That was actually a milk door. So that way the milkman could put the milk in there and shut it. And then you could wake up and get your fresh milk out of there. So then in the late 50s, it then became Park Central. And as we all know today, it is still there, but it is completely no longer kind of the shopping district it was. It no longer had a Goldwater's, a Coffee Dan's, places like that. It's got a huge parking lot, which actually there is now the Creighton Medical School going in. And nowadays you'll take a look and you can find it because of that Park Central kind of walkway going into the Park Central area. So it is still around, even though it opened its doors originally in 1957. and still keeps being refashioned. So coming up next week, we have archaeologist Homer Teal from down in Tucson. So that's going to be a really fun show. So worth checking out. Same bat time, same bat channel. So be sure to check us out. Now, remember, always let me know if you have suggestions, stories, or if you know where any of those carts are. I would love to know where those got to. Now, feel free to reach out to me. You can do that either through the chat, or you can reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or even email. So we do have our second Saturday tour coming up, and that is a limited mask walking tour coming up on May 8th. You can find those on hiphistorian.com. As well as this coming Saturday is 1 year celebration of Arizona virtual Arizona Pride. With COVID, it was like Pride here in Phoenix was canceled. So a group got on and for the last year has been doing a wide variety of programming. And we're actually going to be doing, with my friend Kendra, talking about transgender history right here in Arizona. There's more than you probably think. So, again, thank you all so much for joining us. I always want to give a shout out to, PJ, my wonderful cocktail advisor, who gives me a great libation every week, as well as that intro video from AARP, as well as the one that my friends Chris and Cole worked on. Our outro is going to be Mr. Ho, a Sunny Slope boy with his own, now living on the East Coast with his own Orchestrati Orchestra, as we see some found film footage. And thank you all so much and have an amazing rest of your night.